How are we all? We good? Yeah, it's been an amazing day, hasn't it? All right, let's kick off the last session. I believe everyone in this room does something that they don't realise they're doing. And when they're doing it, they let architecture in. Now just work with me on this. Who here has been on an architecture tour? Maybe I'll rephrase that question. Who here has been overseas in the last 3 years? A show of hands, please. Pretty much as I expected, most of us. And what do we like to do when we go overseas? Do we like to visit buildings? Yeah? I think we all like to visit buildings. You see, when you go overseas and you visit buildings, I think we're all going on little architecture tours. And what is it about these buildings that we're willing to pay thousands of dollars? To sit on a plane for 21 hours, to arrive jet-lagged, to turn up to a building, let's say the Empire State Building, and then you'll wait in queues for hours and hours. You'll even go to the top on a cloudy day. What is significant about these buildings that makes us go and see them? You see, I think these buildings are the symbols of these societies. They tell us a little bit about these societies. They're their stories that is told and retold for every generation since. So what do you take from that? What do you come home with after you visit these buildings? Do you come home with a selfie? Perhaps you come home with a cheap souvenir. Or perhaps you come home with something more. Perhaps you come home with something powerful. Perhaps you come home and want to change a little bit about your life and the life around you. You see, I recently went overseas, much like all of you. And my last week overseas landed me in New York City. And as I was walking around New York City, and I'd walk past the High Line and I'd think, geez, you know, Sydney needs one of those. Or I'd be walking down Broadway and I'd be thinking, why can't George Street be like this? Or I'd stand in front of the Chrysler Tower and I'd look at it and think, Sydney needs towers like this. Or let me put it another way. Think of your home, think of your first universe. Or what I call your first universe. Think of that place that's the epicentre of your world. Think of it when you come home after having been away. Think of the feeling you get when you come home and you walk inside that warm embrace of your building. When you look at that window and that sun is streaming through in that lovely sunny room where you sit there and have that cup of tea. Or that dog that's just happy to see you being home. You know, when architecture gets you feeling, when it moves you in even the most minute way, you are letting architecture in. But what does it mean to let architecture in? You know, I think that's personal. It can mean different things to each and every one of us. It can mean a consciousness that you believe that less can be more, that you want quality over quantity, that you care about your legacy and the legacy of your family and your life, that you want to be proactive, not reactive. You see, the most significant thing about letting architecture in means that you understand that the spaces you inhabit affect you in some way. And you know, Sydney has a great tradition of letting architecture in. Let me tell you a story about the GPO in Sydney. The great colonial architect James Barnett was commissioned to design the GPO. And it was to have a small facade to George Street. And yet it was to have its long, grand facade to a 10-foot lane. Now you think 10 foot, that's twice the size of this red dot I'm standing on. That's the width of a single car garage or the width of that traffic lane you drove here on coming today. So it's not very wide, is it? It seems nuts that the city would get the great architect James Barnett to design the grand facade, the best face of this building onto a 10-foot lane. But you know, Barnett knew it wouldn't remain that way. Barnett wanted his architecture to be transformative. He wanted it to be an enzyme, a catalyst, to change the place. You see, he wanted his great facade to sit opposite a great public place. And that's exactly what happened. The makers and the planners of the city did exactly that. They took it from that 10-foot lane, so a bit over 3 metres, to that 150-foot Martin Place that it is today. I think that's extraordinary. Who here has been to the Anzac Day dawn service? You arrive between 3 or 4 a.m. in the morning, in the cold and the dark. You stand there with thousands of other Sydney-siders. It's packed all the way up to Macquarie Street. And you listen to the bugler play The Last Post. It's solemn, isn't it? It's one of Sydney's special places. You see, Barnett opened the door and the city let architecture in. But it's not the only time that we've let architecture in here in Sydney. Let's take the story of the Harbour Bridge. In the 1920s, the conversation on everyone's lips was a crossing between the north and south of the harbour to reunite the people between the harbour. And Sydney, about that time, was fortunate to have a chief engineer called J.C.C. Bradfield. Bradfield was no ordinary engineer. Bradfield had a great vision. You see, he knew he wanted to make Sydney great. So when he's sitting there looking at the designs for the Harbour Bridge, he could have chosen a smaller bridge, but he didn't. You know, he could have chosen a narrower bridge, but he didn't. He chose a bridge that would be twice the height of the tallest building in Sydney at that time. He chose a bridge that would be the largest single-spanned bridge in the world at that time. He had a great ambition for Sydney. In the last 3 years of its construction, Sydney and Australia was in the Great Depression. Now, I think we've all heard the stories of the Hungry Mile and those deep, dark days in Sydney. But the bridge became a symbol of hope for Sydneysiders. They could see these great big arches. They were hanging from either side of the harbour, reaching towards each other. And the people knew that if the city had this great vision for themselves, that if the Sydney could build the largest spanning bridge in the world at that time, then maybe they too could get through this struggle. They could survive these tough times. And if they could get through these tough times, they could go on and play their part in the city's great future. And that's exactly what happened. In 1932, the bridge was finished. And in 1932, Australia turned the economic corner. Sydney and Australia started to pull itself out of the depression. The bridge went from being a symbol of hope to emblematic of that great success and that great survival, that they all had a shared common experience. They had all bought into Bradfield's dream. But you know, it's not just about grand public spaces. It's not just about things that cities do. It's something that you can do for yourself. In fact, each and every one of you here today can do it for yourself. Let me tell you a little story. Good friends of a good friend of mine, Nikki and Guillermo, they had a great ambition for their home. You see, they bought a little cowshed in Glebe. Now, it sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? A cowshed in Glebe, inner city Sydney. But that's exactly what they bought. And even though it was barely fit for human habitation, it looked like a little humpy sitting at the end of the street. Nikki and Guillermo had great ambition for their home. And Nikki came to me and she said, Shaun, I want to make this a great house. I want to make this house everything that I see for my family and for my future. And when I come home, I want this home to make me feel happy. I want my children to feel happy in this home. And that's exactly what we did. We designed this house that we affectionately know as the Cowshed. Now, we didn't start by saying, let's design Nikki and Guillermo an award-winning house. Or we didn't start there by going, geez, let's try and get this published all around the world. We started simply by investing in Nikki and Guillermo's ambition of what they wanted to have for their home. And let's put this house into perspective. Nikki and Guillermo live there with their 2 children. That's 4 people that live in this house. The house is 132 square metres in size. That's half the average house size in Sydney. On a block size, that is quarter the average house lot in Sydney. All for the cost of a project home. And let's have a look at this house. It's no tin can. It's no little squashed up tuna can. It has large soaring spaces over the living areas. It has beautiful walls that pull apart so those living areas can go out and embrace a lovely sunny garden. It has a lovely transparent mezzanine bedroom that looks over into the living spaces. It has a beautiful ribbon window that wraps around the house that lets light in, makes it light, airy and breezy. But equally, it can be intensely private, even though it sits on the corner of 2 streets. You see, amazing things can happen when you let architecture in. Magic can happen. But you know, it's not just about cities and it's not just about making great public places. It's not even just about you or I. It can be about our connection with others. Letting architecture in can be altruistic. Who here remembers the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004? It's nearly 10 years ago. 277,898 people were killed in that disaster event. Over 500,000 people were displaced. Now, I took a keen interest in this, not only because it was a great disaster, but I had a friend caught up in it. Look, he was okay, but it started an intense interest in disaster recovery. I watched as the first phase of disaster recovery took place. Tents. Tents make sense. They're fast, they're quick to deploy, they're easy to put up. You can house a lot of people very quickly. But as I watched over the weeks and the months, the tents sat there, the tents got wet, the tents started to deteriorate. Tents don't do well in flooded areas, and tents particularly don't do well in the tropics. And imagine withstanding a 27-metre wall of water. That's nearly a nine-story high tsunami that comes through your village, that kills families and friends, and you survive that, only to start to be affected by disease. Because the problem with tents that sit on the ground is it doesn't make for a sanitary environment. And when we don't get a sanitary environment, disease starts to set in. So imagine surviving that tsunami only to watch friends die of cholera, dysentery and typhoid. You see, that's incredibly tragic. It's tragic, but it's also preventable. You see, I saw this problem and I could see that we had to get something between the first phase of tents and the last phase of reconstruction. What we in the office started to call a medium-term housing solution. And look, we saw it just as architectural constraints, these constraints that we deal with every day. We had to get something in there that was light, that could get people up and off the ground, make them safe and warm, that could stand on any terrain. And we also thought it was important that these people could put it up themselves. We also thought it was important that it looked like home. And with that, Grid was born. We named Grid after the Norse goddess of peace. Grid is lightweight, flat packable, relocatable, transportable. Grid stands on 4 legs that can stand on any terrain, anywhere, at any time. I mean, you're not about to get these bulldozers coming in and just grading these amazing streets. Importantly, Grid looks like a house. And Grid can be completely unplugged. It doesn't need to be hooked up to water, to sewer, or electrical mains. And all the services we've relocated on the outside. So if any of those services fail, they don't spoil the interior of the place. I mean, these people have been through enough. And being architects and having lived in a tent before, we thought Grid had to be an amazing space to be in. What we in the office term a joy. It had to be beautiful to be in. And I think it is. And for me, it was important that Grid looked like a home and didn't look like a shipping container. It wasn't made of refrigeration panel. And it didn't look like a builder's shed. Grid was recognisable as a home. And you know what? Grid can be put up by anybody, anywhere, anytime. And we want the local people to put Grid up. Because when they're putting their Grid up, they're putting up their home. They take possession of it. It becomes theirs. I'm going to show you a short video of where we put Grid up in where else but Martin Place as part of the Sydney Architecture Festival. Here's a short video. It looks easy when you play it fast, doesn't it? We put Grid up in 3.5 hours. We think with practice that anybody could put Grid up in 2 hours. So what is it when you let architecture in? What can happen? Amazing things can happen. When you let architecture in, you can recreate the fabric of a city. When you let architecture in, you can bring hope and aspiration in a time of darkness. You can create your own universe in the image that you want to make it. When you let architecture in, you just may be able to save lives. Thank you.